it seems like a good place to kick off here is how you and I got to know each other. So my first question is, what is Horizon?
How do we know each other?
What is Horizon OS Labs? What is it that you're doing there? How does Vidmob fit in that? And maybe that's a good place to start.
For sure. Well, hello, everybody. Thanks for gathering around. Horizon OS Labs is how we uncover new growth opportunities for our brands with an open ecosystem of technology. So we talk a lot about open ecosystems and innovation cycles being incredibly compressed. And so we look out at the full landscape of ad tech and martech, yes, in creative technology like Vidmob, but also in measurement and planning, in the future of MMMs and AI search, like everything under the sun that is a potential growth unlock for our clients is coming through the innovation engine of Horizon OS Labs to uncover those opportunities and pilot them. The means by which, there's about, I think the last stat I saw, about 2,500 new companies in the last 12 months in the MarTech and ad tech space. Incredibly hard to keep.
I'm surprised it's that low. I thought that would have been like just this weekend.
Yeah. Maybe they spiked during this week, but so we run what I think is probably the most comprehensive RFI process in the world to understand what's next, what people are building across all of that terrain, and then we start to curate the best and brightest technology that we think really gives our clients leverage on new growth opportunities. So that's how we met. Our very first cohort, so you're like the OG of the OGs, was about a dozen companies, and Vidmob was one of them. And your peer set wasn't, creative intelligence. So you really were the standout in terms of that crop of partners. And then we move into live pilots and starting to really execute with our brands and determining how that technology actually operates in their workflows and can actually realize the growth through real workflows and real campaigns.
First of all, I'll say that as a New Yorker and someone who just went through all of the excitement of the last week, whenever anyone calls you OG, that goes a long way right now. So thank you for that.
I'm envisioning the tip in
exactly.
As we speak,
just in a much more boring way as it pertains to optimizing 1,000 creative assets. So is it safe to say that sort of like the founding principle of OS Labs is that open systems are better than closed, and I guess sort of AI native is better than sort of like traditional technology?
Yeah, I think our belief in open ecosystems, I think, it comes down to three things, or we think has three main benefits. The first is that more and more, and we'll talk more about kind of how AI is changing the work, but that as you build this more connected system across creative and media, you want your brand DNA, your own intelligence, your own data, your own models to be powering that and not renting someone else's intelligence. That brands encoding their own intelligence layer is in how those systems operate is really critical to driving the best outcomes. The second thing that openness delivers is just adaptability in a time of unbelievable change. Like you want to be flexible to what's new and what's best. And we don't force our clients to kind of buy a bundled solution from them. We help advise and curate solutions that we're not, we don't make any money. When our clients adopt Vidmob, it's all about what's going to deliver the best results for them. And the third is, I think, just in general, open ecosystems bring serendipity and possibility and the unexpected. And so such an exciting part of the work that we do with brands is finding use cases, our use cases in the entertainment space versus our use cases in the CPG versus retail, like very, very different businesses and opportunities come from bringing different partners around the table.
Well, I think it's an incredibly compelling vision and one that certainly makes a lot of sense to me. In a world where we do have 2,500 new companies in the last year or last.
You were startup of the year, by the way. Which how many years old is Vidmob?
Well, I think when we think about it, as compared to Google and Meta and others, we definitely feel like a startup. And I think also just like, I mean, let's be honest, like anything that touches AI, which is probably everything, is probably going to be an entirely new company every 3 months. At this point, if AI is sort of, compute is doubling every 3.4 months, if you don't feel like an entirely new company every 3 or 4 months, like that's probably a problem. And so, my first reaction when I saw that was, obviously, oh, this is exciting. But the second was like, but we're not really a startup. But then I kind of came around, and the reality is, I think it's really wonderful to foster that startup mentality. So, anyway, like I think that, in a world where there's just so much innovation happening, your approach, giving clients that sort of data ownership and control, and giving them the choice, it really feels like it's setting people up for success.
Yeah, I want to actually talk just a little bit more about, from a process standpoint, I think one of the things that brings that out is when we work with our brands through these cohorts of new companies, a part of it is just a general education on who the partners are and the value that they can unlock. And I think brands benefit from every 90 days we run this process, and they're discovering what's new and what's next and how the world is changing. And we really think about not just the individual companies, but what they say as a collective about where the world is headed. And so there's some sort of new discovery and surprise and delight from that. The other thing we do with brands in Horizon OS Labs is we do a lot of one-on-one consultation with them, and we have them articulate a brief around a big growth unlock in their business, and then we bring the right partners around the table for that. And that was one of the main ways that we really started getting going. Was we had a day where we brought 6 or 7 partners trying to solve a challenge in the entertainment space around really uncovering like drivers of box office, and companies of all sizes, including some that you've named, that were around the table. And you guys got the clients thinking about what creative intelligence could do of the kind that you're building that hadn't even occurred to them before. And a lot of that work wasn't even really a media strategy, media planning challenge. It was helping them solve totally new types of engaging in totally new types of work.
Well, I think this gets to my big question, right? So, like, especially here at Cannes, the celebration of creativity. What has always amazed me is that I think everyone here would agree that creative is 50 to 70% of results. Vidmob's been around for 11 years. I've never once had a single person ever that's like, I disagree. But people don't behave like that. And so I guess the question is, like, first, like, why do you think the industry, on one hand, says creative is the most important driver of results, the most important driver of growth, and then on the other hand, doesn't bother to instrument it, doesn't bother to measure it, doesn't bother to optimize it? So why is that the case? And, to your credit, why were you guys able to see through that and actually start taking the leap?
Well, a couple things there. One, I see so many different versions of that stat. And I think the latest one I saw was 60%. So you say 50 to 70, that one is right in the middle. So I say true, like no matter who you talk to, everyone agrees it's somewhere in 50 to 70%. I think why people don't behave that, I mean, certainly people celebrate creativity, like we are here. But I think there's a difference between understanding what worked versus why it worked. And I think understanding that, like, why it worked in a way that's really scalable, and not just like looking at a report of our top 5 assets and sort of like squinting at it and saying, this is what we think is probably driving creative effectiveness. Like, I think it just was not achievable. Like, it was elusive to understand why, because the technology hadn't enabled that, and it was too manual to do. And now with the volume of creative that's out there, it's only hard, could only get harder if you didn't have capability around that. In terms of how we saw through that, I mean, I'll go back to the RFI a little bit. we identify innovation pillars that we believe would be the most needle moving for our brands, and it's informed in part by our own beliefs and intuitions about what that would be, and also talking to our clients every day. And one of the things we hear from them constantly is, I want to understand why, what drives creative effectiveness. Like, it is constantly on their lips. And so when we went out to the market to start curating our cohorts, creative intelligence was something that we were deliberate about wanting to seek out companies that are building in that space. It felt like a huge gap, and surfacing the best of what's out there. And so I don't know, that's how we did it.
It makes sense. So one of the things you and I were discussing when we were catching up a little bit earlier was this idea of creating a shared nomenclature across media and creative teams. So you have these two sort of separate functions that were split apart, 25, 30 years ago, have kind of existed in silos for a long time. And it was sort of difficult for one to talk to the other, right? Like, creative teams rarely had visibility into performance, and media teams rarely had any sort of control over the asset that was 60% of performance. What do you see being enabled by this idea of like one language that the two teams can talk to each other through?
Well, it's only day one of Cannes, but I feel like I've been already listening to so many conversations about creative and media coming back together. I was just listening to one a little bit ago, and I think I can't underscore it enough. I think that the quantification of creative and creating creative data exhaust is the glue that is going to bring creative optimization and media optimization together. I think in general, AI basically collapses the distance between intent and action. It you communicate your intent and then you take action. And both media and creative are serving common goals, but until they had a language that an AI system could understand performance at an attribute level. I mean, we'll talk more about all the different ways there is to slice and dice creative, but I think it's the work that you're doing to quantify and decode creative effectiveness that makes creative legible to the systems that bring it all together.
I was so glad to hear you say media optimization in there, because I feel like for so long, one of the things we found was that no matter how much we explained how improving creative was a vector for driving media performance, because we used the word creative at the end of that conversation, they'd be like, I'm going to get you connected to our creative team. And so what we actually learned was that if we just changed the terminology and called it a sales lift score or a media performance score, all of a sudden that same person would be like, that's exactly what I need. And it was really just about removing a word.
I think just to build on that as well, I think it makes sense to me why creative intelligence, creative scoring is an area where we jumped in our heritage as an agency is more on the media side than the creative side historically. And the kind of measurement and analytics that you are delivering allows us to ensure that media, it's another optimization lever for media optimization. And if we're responsible for the performance of that media, and 60 to 70% of it is tied to the creative itself, and it's not a lever we have, you can't manage what you can't measure kind of thing, that is an unbelievable unlock for a media agency to find new vectors, to take your word, of improvement that just were not there before. So it's a huge opportunity for us.
So I guess maybe I want to talk a little bit about actionability. So one of the things that we've seen is that it's been very clear for years now that having a structured understanding of creative performance was going to be impactful on being able to improve your overall results. But those insights were sort of locked behind very difficult, analytics work or very difficult data science work. And so it made it difficult to get to that. And now I think in this like next wave of AI enablement, we just launched an MCP last week through this Vidmob 360 initiative. Like, it's basically taken that and made it all like fully conversationally available, both to a human and to any agentic system. Like, do you feel like we're entering a phase now where we're going from interesting to actionable?
I definitely do, and I think Alex was showing me a little bit of the MCP this morning. Another buzzword I'm sure everyone's been hearing: MCP all week. But Alex, he took out his phone and was showing me how he was interacting with the data and Vidmob's platform via MCP. I was shocked how you talk to your AI. You're very, very salty. I talked more nicely to my AI, but he was badgering his AI. But it was unbelievable to see that, I think we all know intuitively it's amazing what AI can do, but it can accelerate the bad as much as the good. So it needs good data, it needs good context, or else it's garbage in, garbage out. And so when you can connect the power of AI to an incredibly powerful data asset, like we've been talking about the power of creative data, but when you can hook it up to models that democratize access to it, and soon the AI won't have to endure you yelling at it, not because it wasn't giving you what you want, but just you were very assertive about what you needed. But soon that might be another agent calling that MCP to say, hey, I need a little creative understanding on this other task. And that's where you start to link these pieces together and get to some really, I think, it's hard to wrap your head around where that could go. But so to your point, from interesting to actionable, when you start to get the agents working together.
For the record, I think I was fairly respectful. Like I try to treat these AIs with the utmost care. I just told it, I said, like, I need a strategic brief. Don't give me some bullshit and tell me I need to have more people in my ads. I feel like I'm just being honest.
You need to be clear.
And speaking to it the same way I would talk to a friend of mine. But it's a good call out, and I definitely don't want to be one of the first people culled when they come. So I do apologize, Claude. So all right, so we talked a lot about sort of like creative technology, creative tech, but I think I can cycle back to like a Forrester report 2 or 3 years ago where like all of creative tech was lumped into one wave, and that just made no sense. Like, how do you think about creative tech? What sort of falls into that bucket, and how are you guys sort of building around it?
It's one of 5 innovation areas we focus on. I mentioned we have agentic commerce and AI search and like a whole bunch of other areas within creative tech. We tend to think about it as on one continuum, you have technology that is intervening more on the creative act itself, like helping creative teams do better work or just produce assets. It's part of the creative process. And then on the far other end, you have that moment the consumer is actually experiencing creative, kind of as close as possible to that impression or that engagement. And you have technology that's kind of operating at different places along that life cycle. And then you have technology that's, whether it's a new company or not, like has really embraced AI very natively into the mechanism of what it's doing. It's not necessarily just a co-pilot, but it's embedded in the how. And then you have other systems that are a bit more like traditional rules-based systems that either are not leveraging AI in any way, or it's not as embedded into the product. And we, I think, in general, have a lot of what we've seen come through our cohorts is sort of high up the y-axis in terms of very AI native in the way that it's building its product, making data accessible, and up and down the spectrum in terms of intervening on the consumer experience as well as on the act of creative production.
That makes sense. I know one of the things you were talking about earlier was just like scoring, and what is scoring? What does it mean? You want to talk about that a little bit? Like,
yeah, sure. I think creative scoring is one of the most like visible outputs of creative measurement, creative data. It's something everyone can wrap their head around, is how do I resolve this, what has been, we talked a lot about, like, people didn't know what drove their creative, and now, oh my God, I have a score, is a very popular use case. I think we think about scoring in both inputs, like how are you getting to a score, and there are companies that are using human panels and biometrics and attention and gaze, and you have companies that are using synthetic panels and looking at relationships between attributes and performance outcomes, which I would say is very much in your world. So many different ways to get at it, and then the outputs in terms of what aspects of scoring are actionable for me. It might be I need it at the audience level. It might be I need it. I think another one is you have some advertisers who really want to understand at a very sharp level what is the predicted effectiveness of this ad, and especially this ad, because I'm about to put a lot of investment behind this ad and I need to know how this ad is going to perform. And then you have other brands who want to get a better sense of, over time and across the work that we do, what's the DNA of creative effectiveness generally, so you can produce a lot more great work and sort of decode that. And so I think everything is valid. I think at the end of the day, it's is it predictive of outcomes, and what are the dimensions of scoring that a given brand is right for them, based on how they go to market.
Yeah, and I think I would add, is it predictive of outcomes, and will it continue to be predictive of outcomes, right? Because like I think scoring is one of the most misunderstood, sort of enablements we see of this, where there are people that sort of build basic scoring systems against kind of generic platform best practices that haven't changed in 5 or 6 years, and just go with that. And what we see very clearly is that there are certain of these guidelines that actually are pretty substantially negative to performance. And there are things that were positive 6 months ago but are no longer, and there are things that are positive on Snap but they're not on TikTok. And so I think the key thing is understanding, what are the outcomes that I actually care about? How do I build a set of guidelines that match to that particular outcome or outcomes? And then how do I monitor it so that in a month or 2 months or 6 months, when it's no longer a valid criteria, that I can update it? And I think like that's the key thing, is that making sure that those scoring systems in that rubric are tied to ongoing visibility into performance, so they can be continuously updated. Because I think if there's one thing we know for sure, it's that culture is going to continue to move at least as fast as it ever has, and probably a lot faster.
I'm mindful of our time, but I think 5 minutes. 5 minutes, okay. I want to ask you a question. You were talking to me about an interesting concept in terms of brands turning over some of that creative optimization to some of the closed systems out there, and what you think the drawbacks of that could be. And I'm curious from your seat, just what you think about that versus some of what we've been talking about.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that's come up a lot in conversations with some of our CMOs that we work with, is this fear that as they sort of automate and turn over optimization to sort of an Advantage Plus or PMax or the similar types of tools within all of the platforms, what is the end result, right? And the thinking and the fear is that any kind of looped system is going to evolve and evolve and evolve. And if there's no feedback between these different universes, they evolve along different paths. And, like my parents are both biologists. I think about this in terms of Darwin and like sort of the Galapagos finches. And eventually over time, the finches are different species. They can't mate. They're completely unrelated. And it's one thing if you're a bird. It's another thing if you're, Coca-Cola or something else, and now all of a sudden you have
your YouTube pre-roll,
and you have now different brand species in these different places. That's really anathema to what they're trying to do. So I think this is one of the areas where cross-platform creative data systems can bring and share signal across those to ensure that not only are we optimizing towards performance in those different universes, but we're doing so in a way that enables a cohesive story across the whole.
I think the thing that is like awakening to me is I talked a little bit about at the top of the conversation about open ecosystems and the role of brands taking control of their own data and models. And like 80% of the time that I'm thinking about that, it's in terms of predictive targeting and custom bidding and things that are more on the media side of audience segmentation and predictive modeling around programmatic media buying, let's say. But your commentary there speaks to brands taking control of their creative data and that giving them an ability to take more ownership over how that's used to inform creative iteration and optimization everywhere that their brand shows up. And I think that's such a powerful use case and one of those areas where, again, like it will bring media optimization and creative optimization together if you don't have creative optimization sitting in all these silos that don't speak to one another.
Yeah, and it would have been somewhat useful in the universe where we had 5 or 10 TV ads out there representing us. But in the world we're now in, and are going to be in more and more going forward, where we have tens, if not hundreds of thousands of different assets coming through our Gen AI tooling, and tens, if not hundreds of thousands of different assets coming through all of our influencer and creators. This type of control and governance and learning is more necessary than ever now, because for most consumers, that is the only way they're experiencing your brand, is through this creative that you have no control over, no visibility into, and no idea what's happening. and that is a very unsettling feeling, and also probably not a great way to maintain a brand over time.
So from an unsettling feeling to maybe ending on a high note, we've been talking a lot about AI, but what do you think about the humans in the loop of creative process? Do they get more valuable, less? What I maybe teased with optimism. I think I have an optimistic perspective, but I'm curious what your take is.
More and less. And I think this is important. I think that, again, if this is how a consumer connects with your brand, if you're giving them something that you couldn't be bothered to think about, it's just a template and it has a call to action in the front and an image in the background and a logo in the right, then no one should be surprised when that asset is not remembered. And so I think, true creativity takes on a premium more so than ever as we become awash in this sea of content. And so I think of that as like the upfront, structure, the format that's being built, the unifying theme that the compound branding is built around. But then the technology has to take it and fragment it and fracture it and personalize it, for individuals. So I think it's, creativity is more important than ever, humans more so than ever, but they can't do it on their own.
Yeah, we didn't compare notes on this one, but I have a similar perspective. I think that taste is still will be a scarce resource, and that's going to be so critical to the big ideas that the systems can then take and translate to all the audiences that they need to. I think I would also say good and bad in that I think the floor or the ceiling, whatever it is, the ceiling and the floor are going up. So like mediocre work becomes, I do think you get this like bifurcation where really great breakthrough creative thinking becomes more valuable than ever, but also mediocre work is going to be no longer acceptable for those that are turning it in.
I think mediocre work will become invisible. I think that we will evolve to just be able to not see these things because attention will be at a premium. And so anything that sort of looks like everything else, literally won't even be seen. And there's going to be a lot of that.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you. It was great chatting.
Always great chatting to you too.